The neon glow of Nexus Prime bathed the streets in an eerie, pulsating light. Towering spires of alien architecture pierced the smog-choked sky, their surfaces alive with holographic advertisements and scrolling glyphs in languages no human could fully decipher. The city was a melting pot of species. Towering Zorathians with their chitinous exoskeletons, sleek Valorians with their iridescent skin, and countless others. Among them, humans were an afterthought, a species relegated to the fringes of galactic society after their defeat in the Great Galactic War. In the shadow of the Galactic Council Tower, the heart of intergalactic diplomacy, a lone figure moved through the chaos. Mara Voss was unremarkable in every way. Average height, plain features, and a uniform of dull gray that marked her as a janitor. She pushed a cleaning cart through the labyrinthine corridors of the tower, her movements precise and methodical. To the alien bureaucrats and diplomats who passed her, she was invisible, just another human drifter trying to scrape by in a galaxy that had no use for her kind. But Mara was far from ordinary. Her eyes, a sharp hazel, scanned her surroundings with a vigilance that betrayed her training. Every flicker of light, every footfall, every whisper in the air was catalogued and analyzed. She had been a Black Ops operative in the Terran Defense Corps, a program disbanded after humanity's surrender. The Corps had been erased from history, its operatives either killed or scattered to the winds. Mara had chosen obscurity, burying her past beneath the facade of a simple janitor. It was safer that way, for her, and for anyone who might come looking. Tonight, however, the past came knocking. Mara was cleaning a seldom-used storage room deep within the tower when she felt it, a shift in the air, a presence that didn't belong. Her hand tightened around the handle of her mop, her body tensing as she listened. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, the soft hum of a cloaking device. She didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, Mara swung the mop handle like a staff, striking the air where the sound had originated. There was a grunt of surprise, and the shimmering outline of a figure materialized. A Zorathian assassin, clad in sleek black armor. His mandibles clicked in irritation as he recovered, his 4 eyes locking on Mara with predatory focus. "You're sharper than you look, human," he hissed, his voice a guttural rasp. Mara didn't respond. She dropped the mop and reached into her cart, pulling out a compact plasma cutter. The tool, ostensibly for cleaning stubborn stains, hummed to life in her hand, its blade glowing with deadly intensity. The assassin lunged, his movements a blur. Mara sidestepped, her reflexes honed by years of combat training. The plasma cutter sliced through the air, narrowly missing the assassin's arm. He retaliated with a strike from his wrist-mounted vibroblade, but Mara blocked it with the cutter, the clash of energy sending sparks flying. The fight was brutal and swift. The assassin was faster, stronger, and better equipped, but Mara had something he didn't: ingenuity. She used the environment to her advantage, flipping switches to dim the lights and activate cleaning drones that buzzed around the assassin, distracting him. When he finally overextended, Mara struck, driving the plasma cutter into a gap in his armor. The assassin staggered, his mandibles twitching in shock. You're not just a janitor," he gasped, collapsing to the floor. Mara knelt beside him, her expression cold. "No," she said simply. "I'm not." As the assassin's life faded, Mara searched his body, her fingers brushing against a hidden compartment in his armor. Inside was a data chip, its surface etched with the insignia of the Galactic Warlords. Her blood ran cold. The Warlords were the most powerful figures in the galaxy, a coalition of ruthless leaders who had crushed humanity during the war. Why would they send an assassin after a janitor? She inserted the chip into her wristcom, her heart pounding as files began to scroll across the screen. The data was encrypted, but one phrase stood out. Operation Eclipse. Mara's mind raced. She had thought her past was buried, that she could live out her days in obscurity. But now, the Warlords had come for her, and they wouldn't stop until she was dead. She had no choice but to fight back. As she stood and wiped the blood from her hands, Mara's gaze hardened. The galaxy had underestimated humanity once before. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The janitor who wasn't had just become the galaxy's most dangerous threat. The neon glow of Nexus Prime's underbelly flickered as Mara Voss slipped through the shadows, her hood pulled low over her face. The data chip burned in her pocket like a live grenade, its secrets gnawing at her thoughts. She couldn't stay in the council tower, not after the assassination attempt. The warlords knew where she was, and they wouldn't stop at one assassin. She needed answers, and there was only one person she trusted enough to help her: Jackson Reed. Jackson was a rogue engineer, a former Terran Defense Corps technician who had gone underground after the war. He was brilliant, paranoid, and had a knack for surviving in places no one else could. Mara hadn't seen him in years, but she knew where to find him: the Rust Nebula, a derelict space station orbiting a dying star. The journey was risky. Nexus Prime Spaceport was crawling with warlord enforcers, their crimson armor marking them as the galaxy's most feared enforcers. Mara kept her head down, blending into the crowd of traders, smugglers, and refugees. She boarded a rickety freighter bound for the Outer Rim, her nerves on edge as the ship rumbled to life. The Rust Nebula was a graveyard of forgotten ships and abandoned dreams. The station itself was a patchwork of salvaged hulls and jury-rigged systems, its corridors lit by flickering lights and the occasional spark of a malfunctioning panel. Mara navigated the maze with ease, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. She found Jackson in his workshop, surrounded by half-dismantled drones and holographic schematics. He looked up as she entered, his sharp features breaking into a grin. "Mara Voss," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "I was wondering when you'd show up." "Cut the crap, Jackson," Mara snapped, tossing the data chip onto his workbench. "I need you to decrypt this, now." Jackson raised an eyebrow, picking up the chip and examining it. "Warlord tech," he muttered, his grin fading. "What did you do to piss them off?" "They sent an assassin after me," Mara said, her voice tight. "I need to know why." Jackson's expression turned serious. He plugged the chip into his console, his fingers flying across the keyboard as lines of code filled the screen. The room was silent except for the hum of machinery and the occasional beep of the console. Finally, Jackson leaned back, his face pale. "You're not going to like this," he said. "Just tell me," Mara demanded. "It's called Operation Eclipse," Jackson said, pulling up a holographic projection of the data. "The warlords are building a superweapon, a bioweapon designed to target human DNA. They're planning to wipe out humanity, Mara. Every last one of us." Mara's stomach churned as she stared at the hologram. The schematics showed a massive orbital platform, its surface bristling with weapons and genetic modification arrays. The scale of it was staggering, a weapon capable of erasing an entire species from the galaxy. "Why now?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The war's over. We lost. What do they have to gain?" Jackson hesitated, then pulled up another file. "This," he said, pointing to a series of encrypted messages. "The warlords are scared, Mara. They've been monitoring human colonies, and they've noticed something unusual. Humans are adapting, faster than any other species. They're afraid we'll rise again, and this time they won't be able to stop us." Mara's mind raced. She had always known humanity was resilient, but this was something else. The warlords weren't just trying to eliminate a threat. They were trying to erase a potential rival. "We have to stop them," Mara said, her voice firm. Jackson snorted. "We? Mara, I'm just a guy with a wrench. You're talking about taking on the most powerful beings in the galaxy. You'll need an army." "Then I'll find one," Mara said, her eyes blazing. "But first, I need to know everything about Operation Eclipse. Where is it? How far along are they? What's their timeline?" Jackson sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Give me a few hours," he said. "I'll see what I can dig up. But Mara, this is suicide, you know that, right?" Mara didn't answer. She turned and walked to the window, staring out at the swirling nebula beyond. The stars seemed colder now, their light dimmed by the weight of what she had learned. But deep down, a fire burned. The warlords had made a mistake. They had underestimated her, underestimated humanity, and now they would pay for it. As Jackson worked, Mara's thoughts turned to the assassin, Krethar. He had been a formidable opponent, but there had been something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, perhaps. She wondered if he had known the truth about Operation Eclipse. If he had, would it have changed anything? "Got it," Jackson said, breaking her reverie. He pulled up a star map, highlighting a remote system on the edge of warlord territory. "The bioweapon is being developed here on a moon called Erebus. It's heavily fortified, but there's a window of opportunity. The warlords are hosting a Galactic Unity Summit in 3 weeks. They're planning to unveil the weapon there. Mara's jaw tightened. 3 weeks. It wasn't much time, but it was enough. Thanks, Jackson, she said, turning to leave. Wait, Jackson called after her. You're really going to do this, aren't you? Mara paused at the door, her hand resting on the frame. They think we're weak, she said, her voice steady. It's time to show them how wrong they are. And with that, she stepped into the shadows, her resolve unshakable. The Warlords had awakened a sleeping giant, and Mara Voss was just the beginning. The Rust Nebula faded into the void as Mara's stolen freighter, the Starblade, hurtled toward the outer rim. The ship was a relic, its hull patched with scrap metal and its engines sputtering, but it was fast enough to outrun the Warlord patrols that prowled the trade lanes. Mara sat in the cockpit, her hands steady on the controls, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. She couldn't do this alone. The data Jackson had decrypted painted a grim picture. Operation Eclipse was nearing completion, and the Warlords had eyes everywhere. If Mara was going to stop them, she needed allies, people who could fight, think, and survive in the shadows. People like her. Her first stop was Kasari Station, a floating den of scum and villainy orbiting a gas giant. It was the kind of place where credits bought loyalty and secrets were traded like currency. Mara docked the Starblade in a remote bay, her hood pulled low as she stepped into the station's grimy corridors. She found her first recruit in a dimly lit cantina, his hulking frame hunched over a glass of something that smelled like engine coolant. Gorak, a Krellian mercenary, was a brute of a man with a reputation for getting the job done. No questions asked. Mara slid into the seat across from him, her eyes scanning the room for threats. Gorak, she said, her voice low. I need your help. The Krellian looked up, his 4 eyes narrowing. Mara Voss, he rumbled. Heard you were dead. Not yet, Mara replied, but the Warlords are trying to change that. Gorak leaned back, his massive arms crossed. What's in it for me? Credits, Mara said, and a chance to stick it to the Warlords. Gorak's lips curled into a grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I'm in. Her next recruit was harder to find. Lyra Voss, no relation, was a Valorian hacker, a ghost in the system who could crack any code and bypass any security. Mara tracked her to a hidden data hub deep within the station, where Lyra was busy infiltrating a corporate mainframe. Lyra, Mara said, stepping into the room. The Valorian spun around, her iridescent skin shimmering with alarm. Who the hell are you? She demanded, her fingers hovering over a console. Someone who needs your skills, Mara replied, holding up the data chip. I've got a job that'll make your usual gigs look like child's play. Lyra hesitated, then gestured for Mara to continue. As Mara explained the situation, Lyra's expression shifted from skepticism to intrigue. You're talking about taking down the Warlords, Lyra said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Do you have any idea how insane that is? I do, Mara said. But if we don't stop them, humanity is finished, and if they're willing to wipe us out, who's to say your people won't be next? Lyra's eyes narrowed as she considered this. Finally, she nodded. All right, I'm in, but if this goes south, I'm not sticking around to die with you. The final member of Mara's ragtag team was the most unexpected. Krethar, the Zorathian assassin who had tried to kill her, tracked her down on Kasari Station. Mara was in the middle of negotiating with a weapons dealer when Krethar appeared, his cloaking device deactivating as he stepped into the light. Mara's hand went to her plasma cutter, but Krethar raised his hands in a gesture of peace. I'm not here to fight, he said, his voice calm. Then why are you here? Mara demanded, her eyes narrowing. I've been asking myself the same question, Krethar admitted. The Warlords sent me to kill you, but you spared my life. That complicates things. Mara studied him, searching for any sign of deception. What do you want? Answers, Krethar said. The Warlords told me you were a threat, but they didn't tell me why. I want to know the truth. Mara hesitated, then handed him the data chip. See for yourself. Krethar inserted the chip into his wrist comm, his expression darkening as he read the files. When he looked up, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or anger. This is genocide, he said, his voice low. It is, Mara replied, and if we don't stop them, it'll be on all of us. Krethar was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll help you. But if we survive this, I want to guarantee that my people won't be targeted. Deal, Mara said, extending her hand. Krithar hesitated, then clasped her forearm in a gesture of solidarity. With her team assembled, Mara set her sights on Erebus, the moon where Operation Eclipse was being developed. The journey was fraught with danger, as Warlord patrols scoured the sector for any sign of rebellion. The Starblade's engines groaned under the strain, but Mara pushed the ship to its limits, her determination unwavering. As they approached Erebus, Mara gathered her team in the ship's cramped briefing room. A holographic projection of the moon filled the space, its surface dotted with fortified installations and defense systems. "This is it," Mara said, her voice steady. "We infiltrate the facility, sabotage the bioweapon, and get out alive. Any questions?" Gorak cracked his knuckles. "What's the plan if we get caught?" "We don't," Mara replied. Lyra rolled her eyes. "Great plan, really inspiring." Krithar, meanwhile, studied the hologram with a critical eye. "The facility's defenses are formidable, but not impenetrable. If we can disable their sensors, we might have a chance." Mara nodded. "Lyra, that's your job. Gorak, you're with me. We'll handle the ground assault. Krithar, you're our backup. If things go south, you're our way out." The team exchanged nods, their resolve hardening. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew what was at stake. As the Starblade descended toward Erebus, Mara felt a surge of determination. The Warlords had underestimated her once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The moon of Erebus loomed large in the viewport, its surface a desolate expanse of jagged rock and swirling storms. The Warlord facility was a monolithic structure, its blackened spires rising like claws from the barren landscape. Mara's team gathered in the Starblade's cargo hold, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the ship's interior lights. "Remember the plan," Mara said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Lyra, you're on sensors. Gorak and I will handle the ground assault. Krithar, you're our eyes in the sky. If anything goes wrong, we'll need you to get us out of here." Lyra nodded, her fingers already dancing across the holographic interface of her hacking rig. "I'll disable their security grid, but it won't last long. You'll have a 10-minute window to get in and out." 10 minutes? Gorak grunted, his massive arms crossed over his chest. "That's cutting it close." "It's all we've got," Mara replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned to Krithar, who stood silently in the corner, his cloaking device shimmering faintly. "You good?" Krithar's mandibles clicked softly. "I'll do my part, but if this goes south, don't expect me to die for your cause." Mara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Noted." The team moved into position as the Starblade descended into the moon's thin atmosphere. Lyra's fingers flew across her console, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Security grid is down," she announced. "You've got 10 minutes. Starting now." Mara and Gorak dropped from the ship's ramp, their boots crunching against the moon's rocky surface. The facility loomed ahead, its defenses momentarily silenced. They moved quickly, their movements synchronized from years of combat experience. Inside the facility, the air was thick with the hum of machinery and the acrid smell of chemicals. Mara's plasma cutter glowed faintly in the dim light, its blade humming with restrained energy. Gorak carried a massive pulse rifle, its barrel glowing with a faint blue light. "Stay sharp," Mara whispered as they approached a set of heavy blast doors. "We don't know what's waiting for us on the other side." Gorak grunted in response, his 4 eyes scanning the corridor for threats. Mara activated her wrist comm, pulling up a holographic map of the facility. "The bioweapon is in the central chamber. We need to move fast." The blast doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a squad of Warlord enforcers. The aliens were heavily armed, their crimson armor gleaming in the harsh light. Mara didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her plasma cutter slicing through the first enforcer's armor with ease. Gorak opened fire, his pulse rifle sending bolts of energy tearing through the enemy ranks. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Mara moved like a shadow, her strikes precise and deadly. Gorak was a force of nature, his sheer strength and firepower overwhelming the enforcers, but the Warlord's forces were relentless, and more reinforcements were on the way. "We're running out of time!" Mara shouted, her voice barely audible over the din of battle. "No kidding," Gorak roared, slamming his fist into an enforcer's helmet. Meanwhile, Lyra monitored the situation from the Starblade, her fingers flying across her console. "Mara, you've got 3 minutes left!" "The security grid is coming back online." "We're almost there," Mara replied, her voice strained. She and Gorak burst into the central chamber, their weapons at the ready. The bioweapon loomed before them, a massive construct of steel and glass filled with swirling green liquid. Mara's stomach churned as she realized what it was, a genetic bomb designed to target human DNA and spread like a virus. "We need to destroy it," Mara said, her voice tight. "No kidding," Gorak muttered, raising his pulse rifle. But before he could fire, a voice echoed through the chamber. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Mara spun around, her plasma cutter at the ready. Standing in the doorway was Commander Vrax, a high-ranking warlord officer and the mastermind behind Operation Eclipse. His crimson armor was adorned with the insignia of the warlords, and his eyes gleamed with malice. "You've caused quite a mess, human," Vrax said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But your little rebellion ends here." Mara's grip tightened on her weapon. "We'll see about that." Vrax smirked, then raised his hand. A dozen enforcers filed into the room, their weapons trained on Mara and Gorak. "You're outnumbered," Vrax said. "Surrender, and I'll make your deaths quick." Mara glanced at Gorak, who gave a barely perceptible nod. They were out of options. "Now," Mara shouted, diving behind a console as Gorak opened fire. The room erupted into chaos. Mara's plasma cutter sliced through the air, its blade cutting through armor and flesh alike. Gorak's pulse rifle roared, sending bolts of energy tearing through the enemy ranks. But the enforcers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a shimmering figure appeared in the doorway, Krythar. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice calm despite the chaos. Mara didn't have time to respond. Krythar activated his cloaking device, ice disappearing from sight. A moment later, the enforcers began to fall, their bodies crumpling to the ground as Krythar moved through them like a ghost. Vrax's smirk faded as he realized what was happening. "You!" he snarled, raising his weapon. But before he could fire, Mara was on him. Her plasma cutter sliced through his armor, the blade piercing his chest. Vrax gasped, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing to the ground. The room fell silent, the only sound the hum of the bioweapon. Mara turned to Gorak and Krythar, her chest heaving. "We need to destroy it," she said, her voice firm. Gorak nodded, raising his pulse rifle. "Stand back." The weapon fired, its energy bolts tearing through the bioweapon's fragile casing. The green liquid spilled out, hissing as it came into contact with the air. The chamber filled with smoke, the bioweapon collapsing in on itself. "Let's get out of here," Mara said, her voice barely audible over the sound of alarms. The team sprinted for the exit, the facility crumbling around them. As they reached the Starblade, Lyra was already powering up the engines. "Cutting it close," she said as they boarded the ship. "Story of my life," Mara replied, collapsing into a seat as the ship lifted off. As the Starblade soared into the void, Mara allowed herself a moment of relief. They had struck a blow against the Warlords, but the fight was far from over. And Mara knew one thing for certain: the Warlords would not take this lightly. The Starblade hurtled through hyperspace, its engines humming with strained effort. Inside the ship, the air was thick with tension. Mara sat in the cockpit, her eyes fixed on the swirling vortex of light outside the viewport. Behind her, the rest of the team was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. They had destroyed the bioweapon on Erebus, but the victory felt hollow. The Warlords were still out there, and Mara knew they wouldn't stop until humanity was eradicated. She needed answers that only the Warlords themselves could provide. "We need to hit them where it hurts," Mara said, breaking the silence. Gorak, who was busy cleaning his pulse rifle, looked up. "And where's that?" "Their command center," Mara replied, "the heart of their operations. If we can infiltrate it, we might find anything that can help us stop them for good." Lyra, who was hunched over her hacking rig, frowned. "You're talking about the Obsidian Citadel. That place is a fortress. Even if we could get in, we'd never get out alive." "We don't have a choice," Mara said, her voice firm. "The Warlords are planning something big. We need to know what it is." Krythar, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "The Citadel is heavily guarded, but it's not impenetrable. If we can find a way inside, we might be able to access their data core." Mara turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You sound like you've been there before." Krythar's mandibles clicked softly. "I have. The Warlords trained me there. I know its weaknesses." The room fell silent as the team processed this. Finally, Lyra sighed. "All right, let's say we do this. How do we get in?" Krethar leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. There's a hidden entrance, a maintenance shaft used for repairs. It's not heavily guarded, but it's rigged with traps. If we can disable them, we can slip inside unnoticed. Mara nodded. Then that's our way in. Lyra, you'll handle the traps. Gorak, you're with me. Krethar, you'll guide us through the citadel. The team exchanged nods, their resolve hardening. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. The Obsidian Citadel was a towering monolith of blackened steel and glowing runes, its spires piercing the clouds of a storm-racked planet. The Starblade approached cautiously, its cloaking device activated to avoid detection. As they neared the citadel, Krethar pointed to a small, unassuming hatch on the underside of the structure. There, he said, the maintenance shaft. Mara guided the ship into position, her hand steady on the controls. Lyra, you're up. The Valorian hacker nodded, her fingers flying across her console. Disabling the traps now. Give me a minute. The team waited in tense silence as Lyra worked. Finally, she gave a satisfied nod. We're in, but we'll need to move fast. The traps will reset in 10 minutes. Mara stood, her plasma cutter glowing faintly in the dim light. Let's go. The maintenance shaft was narrow and cramped, its walls lined with pulsating cables and flickering lights. The team moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Krethar led the way, his knowledge of the citadel's layout proving invaluable. As they reached the end of the shaft, Krethar held up a hand. Wait, he whispered. There's a patrol ahead. Mara peered around the corner, her eyes narrowing. A squad of Warlord enforcers stood guard, their crimson armor gleaming in the harsh light. We need to take them out quietly, Mara said, her voice barely audible. Krethar nodded, his cloaking device activating as he disappeared from sight. A moment later, the enforcers began to fall, their bodies crumpling to the ground as Krethar moved through them like a ghost. The team pressed on, their movements swift and silent. They reached the data core without further incident, its massive doors looming before them. Lyra, Mara said, gesturing to the control panel. The Valorian hacker stepped forward, her fingers dancing across the interface. This is it, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. The Warlords' secrets are in here. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a cavernous chamber filled with holographic displays and glowing consoles. Mara stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for threats. We need to find out what they're planning, she said, her voice firm. Lyra nodded, her fingers flying across the console. Give me a minute. The team waited in tense silence as Lyra worked. Finally, she looked up, her expression grim. You're not going to like this, she said. Just tell me, Mara demanded. Lyra pulled up a holographic projection, its glowing lines forming a map of the galaxy. The Warlords are planning a full-scale invasion, she said. They're going to attack Earth and its colonies simultaneously. And they're not just planning to conquer, they're planning to exterminate. Mara's stomach churned as she stared at the map. The scale of the Warlords' plan was staggering. A coordinated assault that would leave humanity with no chance of survival. We need to warn them, Mara said, her voice tight. It's too late, Lyra replied. The invasion fleet is already on the move. They'll reach Earth in 3 days. The room fell silent as the weight of Lyra's words sank in. Mara's mind raced, searching for a solution. There's one more thing, Lyra said, her voice hesitant. What? Mara asked, her eyes narrowing. Lyra pulled up another file, her expression grim. The Warlords have a new weapon, a planet killer. They're planning to use it on Earth. Mara's blood ran cold. The Warlords weren't just planning to conquer humanity, they were planning to erase it from existence. We need to stop them, Mara said, her voice firm. How? Gorak asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Mara's eyes gleamed with determination. We hit them where it hurts. We take out their command center. The team exchanged nods, their resolve hardening. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. As they prepared to leave the data core, Mara felt a surge of determination. The Warlords had underestimated her once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The Starblade emerged from hyperspace above Nexus Prime, its engines roaring as it descended through the planet's atmosphere. The city below was a sprawling labyrinth of neon-lit streets and towering spires, but Mara had no time to admire the view. The Warlords' invasion fleet was on its way to Earth, and Nexus Prime was their staging ground. We need to take out their command center, Mara said, her voice tight with urgency. If we can disrupt their communications, we might buy Earth some time. And how do you plan to do that? Lyra asked, her fingers flying across her console. The command center is in the heart of the city, surrounded by warlord forces. We'll have to fight our way in, Mara replied, her eyes narrowing. Gorak, you're with me. Lyra, you'll handle their systems. Krethar, you're our backup. The team exchanged nods, their resolve hardening. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. The Starblade touched down in a secluded alley, its cloaking device activated to avoid detection. Mara and Gorak stepped out, their weapons at the ready. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual bustle of Nexus Prime replaced by an ominous silence. Stay sharp, Mara whispered, her eyes scanning the shadows. They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The command center loomed ahead, its blackened spires piercing the sky. Warlord enforcers patrolled the perimeter, their crimson armor gleaming in the harsh light. We'll never get through that, Gorak muttered, his pulse rifle gripped tightly in his hands. We don't have to, Mara replied, her voice calm. Lyra, you're up. The Valorian hacker's voice crackled over their comms. Disabling their security now. You've got 5 minutes. The team moved in, their movements swift and silent. Mara's plasma cutter glowed faintly in the dim light, its blade humming with restrained energy. Gorak's pulse rifle was a steady presence at her side, its barrel glowing with a faint blue light. As they reached the command center's entrance, the doors slid open with a hiss. Mara and Gorak stepped inside, their weapons at the ready. The interior was a maze of corridors and chambers, each one filled with warlord enforcers and advanced technology. Mara's mind raced as she navigated the labyrinth, her instincts guiding her toward the heart of the facility. We're in, Mara said, her voice tight. Lyra, where's the control room? 2 levels up, Lyra replied. But you've got company. Mara's eyes narrowed as a squad of enforcers rounded the corner, their weapons trained on her and Gorak. Take cover, Mara shouted, diving behind a console as the enforcers opened fire. The room erupted into chaos. Mara's plasma cutter sliced through the air, its blade cutting through armor and flesh alike. Gorak's pulse rifle roared, sending bolts of energy tearing through the enemy ranks. But the enforcers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a shimmering figure appeared in the doorway. Krethar. Need a hand? He asked, his voice calm despite the chaos. Mara didn't have time to respond. Krethar activated his cloaking device, disappearing from sight. A moment later, the enforcers began to fall, their bodies crumpling to the ground as Krethar moved through them like a ghost. The team pressed on, their movements swift and silent. They reached the control room without further incident, its massive doors looming before them. Lyra, Mara said, gesturing to the control panel. The Valorian hacker stepped forward, her fingers dancing across the interface. This is it, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. The Warlord's secrets are in here. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a cavernous chamber filled with holographic displays and glowing consoles. Mara stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for threats. We need to find out what they're planning, she said, her voice firm. Lyra nodded, her fingers flying across the console. Give me a minute. The team waited in tense silence as Lyra worked. Finally, she looked up, her expression grim. You're not going to like this, she said. Just tell me, Mara demanded. Lyra pulled up a holographic projection, its glowing lines forming a map of the galaxy. The Warlords are planning a full-scale invasion, she said. They're going to attack Earth and its colonies simultaneously. And they're not just planning to conquer, they're planning to exterminate. Mara's stomach churned as she stared at the map. The scale of the Warlords' plan was staggering. A coordinated assault that would leave humanity with no chance of survival. We need to warn them, Mara said, her voice tight. It's too late, Lyra replied. The invasion fleet is already on the move. They'll reach Earth in 3 days. The room fell silent as the weight of Lyra's words sank in. Mara's mind raced, searching for a solution. There's one more thing, Lyra said, her voice hesitant. What? Mara asked, her eyes narrowing. Lyra pulled up another file, her expression grim. The Warlords have a new weapon, a planet killer. They're planning to use it on Earth. Mara's blood ran cold. The Warlords weren't just planning to conquer humanity, they were planning to erase it from existence. We need to stop them, Mara said, her voice firm. How? Gorak asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Mara's eyes gleamed with determination. We hit them where it hurts. We take out their command center. The team exchanged nods, their resolve hardening. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. As they prepared to leave the control room, Mara felt a surge of determination. The Warlords had underestimated her once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. The skies above Nexus Prime burned as the Warlords' fleet descended, a swarm of jagged warships blotting out the stars. Mara's stolen fighter darted through the chaos, its engines screaming as she weaved between laser fire and debris. Her hands were steady on the controls, her mind razor-sharp despite the exhaustion gnawing at her. She'd been running on adrenaline for days, and it was starting to show. Her vision blurred at the edges, her reflexes just a fraction slower. But there was no time to falter. Earth's survival hinged on this moment. The Warlords' backup plan was brutal in its simplicity. If the bioweapon failed, they'd bombard Earth into oblivion. The fleet was their hammer, and humanity was the anvil. Mara's team had scattered during the assault on the Council Tower, each fighting their own battles. Jackson Reed was somewhere in the lower levels, sabotaging the Warlords' ground defenses. The alien mercenary, Vark, had gone silent after taking a hit. The hacker, Lyra, was still in the comms hub, desperately trying to disrupt the fleet's coordination. And Krithar was the wild card. Mara's fighter shuddered as a missile grazed its hull. She banked hard, narrowly avoiding a collision with a Warlord cruiser. Her comms crackled faintly, Lyra's voice breaking through the static. "Mara, signal, sabotage, Krithar." The transmission cut out before she could make sense of it. Mara gritted her teeth. Krithar had fought beside her in the tower, but his loyalty was a fragile thing. Could he be trusted now, when it mattered most? She didn't have time to dwell on it. A Warlord destroyer loomed ahead, its cannons swiveling to lock onto her. Mara pushed the fighter into a steep dive, skimming the destroyer's surface. She deployed a cluster of EMP mines, Jackson's handiwork, and watched as they latched onto the ship's hull. A split second later, the destroyer's systems shorted out, its weapons falling silent. One down, she thought grimly, but the fleet was vast, and her fighter was running low on fuel and ammo. In the distance, the Warlord's flagship loomed like a predator among prey. It was massive, bristling with weaponry, its shields shimmering with an eerie green glow. Mara knew it was the key. Take it down, and the fleet would falter. But getting close enough would be a suicide run. She glanced at the holo display on her dashboard, showing the positions of her scattered allies. Lyra's signal was still active, but Vark's had vanished. Jackson's was faint, his last known location deep in enemy territory. And Krithar, his signal was moving, fast, toward the flagship. Mara's stomach twisted. Was he defecting? Returning to the Warlord's fold? Or was he executing his own plan? She couldn't risk it. She punched the throttle, her fighter surging forward, the G-forces pressing her into the seat. The space between her and the flagship was a gauntlet of enemy fighters and flak. She dodged and weaved, her reflexes pushed to their limit. A Warlord interceptor locked onto her tail, its lasers carving through the void. Mara deployed countermeasures, a cloud of reflective chaff, and the interceptor veered off, confused. But the effort cost her. Her fighter's shields were nearly gone. As she closed in on the flagship, a new signal appeared on her display. It was Krethar's fighter, launching from the flagship's hangar. Mara's heart raced. If he was betraying them, this was the moment. She opened a channel, but before she could speak, Krethar's voice cut through, low and urgent. "Stay back. It's done." The transmission ended as quickly as it began. Mara hesitated, her finger hovering over the trigger. Then she saw it, a flicker of light from the flagship's core. A split second later, the ship erupted in a blinding explosion, the shockwave rippling outward. Krithar had sabotaged it. He'd betrayed his former masters. The Warlord fleet faltered, their coordination unraveling without the flagship's command. Mara seized the moment, targeting the nearest cruiser. Her missiles struck true, punching through its weakened shields. Around her, the tide began to turn. Galactic Council defense ships, previously outmatched, rallied against the disorganized Warlord forces. Mara's fighter was battered, its systems failing, but she kept fighting, her focus unyielding. Then a new threat emerged. A Warlord dreadnought, hidden until now, decloaked on the edge of the battlefield, its weapons powered up, targeting Earth. Mara's display lit up with warnings. She had seconds to act. With her fighter nearly crippled, she made a desperate choice. She set a collision course, diverting all remaining power to the engines. The dreadnought's defenses opened fire, and her fighter shook violently. She ejected just before impact, the explosion consuming both ships in a fiery bloom. Floating in the void, her suit's oxygen dwindling, Mara watched the battle's final moments. The Warlord fleet was in disarray, their dreadnought gone. Council ships pressed the advantage, picking off the stragglers. Krythar's fighter drifted nearby, damaged but intact. He'd survived. Their eyes met across the void, a silent understanding passing between them. He'd made his choice. So had she. As a Council rescue shuttle locked onto her signal, Mara closed her eyes, letting herself exhale for the first time in what felt like days. The fight wasn't over, but the Warlords' grip on the galaxy was slipping. Humanity had been pushed to the brink, but they'd held the line, and Mara, the janitor who wasn't, had been the spark. The Council rescue shuttle's airlock hissed as it sealed shut, the sound barely audible over the hum of its engines. Mara slumped against the wall, her suit's visor fogged with condensation from her ragged breaths. The shuttle was cramped, its interior a mess of exposed wires and hastily patched panels, a testament to the Council's desperation during the battle. She glanced around at the other survivors, a handful of Council soldiers, their armor scorched and dented, Lyra, her face pale but defiant, clutching a battered datapad, and Krythar, his expression unreadable, blood dripping from a gash on his forearm. Jackson and Vark were still unaccounted for. Mara's chest tightened at the thought, but she pushed it aside. There was no time for grief. Not yet. The shuttle lurched as it docked with the Council's command station, a massive orbital platform bristling with cannons and sensor arrays. Through the viewport, Mara could see the wreckage of the battle, shattered hulls of Warlord ships drifting aimlessly, interspersed with the burning remnants of Council vessels. The cost had been staggering, but the Warlord's fleet was broken. Earth still stood, its blue-green surface visible in the distance, defiant against the void. As the survivors disembarked, a Council officer approached, his uniform crisp despite the chaos. "Mara Voss," he said, his voice clipped. "The Council demands your presence, immediately." Mara exchanged a glance with Krythar. She didn't trust the Council any more than she trusted the Warlords, but she nodded. They needed answers, and the Council owed them that much. The command chamber was a hive of activity, holographic displays flickering with tactical data and casualty reports. Alien delegates from a dozen species argued in overlapping tongues, their voices a cacophony of anger and fear. At the center of the room stood High Counselor Tavar, a towering, multi-limbed being whose species was known for its intellect and ruthlessness. Tavar's crystalline eyes fixed on Mara as she entered, her team trailing behind her. "You've caused quite the disruption," Tavar said, his voice resonating like struck glass. "The Warlords' coalition is in ruins, their leaders dead or fleeing, but the galaxy is far from stable. You've exposed a conspiracy that implicates half the Council itself." Mara's jaw tightened. She'd suspected as much. The Warlords couldn't have operated on this scale without allies within the Council. She stepped forward, her boots echoing on the polished floor. "Then expose them. Root out the traitors. Or are you afraid of what you'll find?" Tavar's mandibles twitched, a sign of irritation. "You overstep, human. But you are not wrong. The Council has grown complacent, corrupt. That changes now." Before Mara could respond, the chamber's lights flickered. A low rumble echoed through the station, followed by the blare of alarms. The holographic displays shifted, showing a Warlord battleship, sleek and deadly, emerging from a warp jump just beyond the station's defenses. It was a suicide run, a final act of defiance from the Warlords. Mara's pulse quickened. They weren't done yet. "They're targeting the station," Lyra said, her fingers flying over her datapad. "Shields are down to 30%. They've got a clear shot." Mara turned to Tavar. "Evacuate the station. Now." "There's no time," Tavar replied, his voice calm despite the impending disaster. "But there is another option." He gestured to a nearby console where a schematic of the station's experimental weapons system appeared. A prototype energy cannon. Unstable but powerful. It could destroy the battleship before it fires. Mara didn't hesitate. "Where is it?" Tavar's eyes narrowed. "The lower decks, but the system is damaged. It needs manual activation." "I'll do it," Mara said. Krithar stepped forward, his hand on his blade. I'm coming with you. The two of them moved quickly, navigating the station's labyrinthine corridors as the alarms blared. The air was thick with smoke, the walls vibrating from the battleship's relentless assault. They reached the lower decks just as a violent tremor rocked the station, sending debris cascading from the ceiling. The prototype cannon's control room was a wreck, its console sparking, its floor littered with the bodies of technicians who hadn't made it out. Mara knelt by the main console, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The system was a mess, its power relays overloaded and its targeting matrix offline. She rerouted what little power remained, her mind racing. Krithar stood guard, his eyes scanning the corridor for any sign of Warlord boarding parties. Got it, Mara said, the console lighting up with a faint glow. But the firing mechanism's jammed. Someone needs to manually release the safety. Krithar met her gaze, understanding instantly. Go, I'll handle it. Mara hesitated for half a second, then nodded. She sprinted back toward the command chamber, the station shaking around her. Through the viewport, she could see the Warlord battleship, its weapons glowing with deadly intent. She reached the chamber just as Lyra shouted, They're charging their main cannon! Mara slammed her fist onto the console, linking the prototype's targeting system to the station's sensors. Krithar, now! For a moment, there was nothing. Then the station shuddered as the prototype cannon fired, a blinding beam of energy lancing through the void. It struck the battleship dead on, the ship erupting in a massive fireball. The shockwave hit the station, throwing Mara to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, her ears ringing, and looked to the viewport. The battleship was gone, its wreckage scattering like ash on the wind. But the cost was high. The lower decks were breached, entire sections of the station torn away. Krithar's signal was gone. Mara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to focus. The Warlords were finished. Their fleet was destroyed, their leaders dead or scattered. The Council would rebuild, and humanity would rise from the ashes. As the station's survivors began the slow process of recovery, Mara stood at the edge of the command chamber, staring out at Earth. It was still there, still fighting. And so was she. The galaxy had underestimated humanity for too long. That wouldn't happen again. In the days that followed, the Council's corruption was laid bare. Traitors were exposed, their alliances with the Warlords undeniable. Tavar led the purge, his ruthlessness now a weapon for justice. Mara declined their offers of power, their medals and titles. She'd never been one for the spotlight. Instead, she returned to Nexus Prime, blending into the crowds as she always had. But the galaxy knew her name now, whispered in fear and respect. Humanity's rise had begun, not with fleets or weapons, but with a janitor who refused to die. And as Mara walked the neon-lit streets, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in years, she felt something like hope. The galaxy wasn't ready for what humanity could become, but it would learn.